And now on to Archaic Greece. Archaic Greece is the period that historians define of the years 800 BCE to 500 BCE. This was all in part due to the population boom that began at the very end of the Dark Ages in Greece. And that population boom was in thanks to all the Phoenician ships that they started copying. They were able to get more food by trading with others, and throughout all of throughout the former Mycenaean period area of Greece, right, with each other, as well as other groups such as, the Phoenicians and others that were around at the time. And so they started actually trading and getting more food, which causes people to start having larger families and being able to support larger families. And so more people are being born, more people are reaching adulthood and being able to have children, which are causing more people to be born, okay? Which eventually starts causing a problem. And this problem is that eventually you end up getting to the point where Greece is now having too many people for how much food it can grow. And so what ends up causing next to happen is that issue, okay? Colonization is what happens out of this, okay? People start realizing in the major cities of Greece that, or the polis, right, that they could actually send people on ships to various parts of the Mediterranean Sea or Aegean Sea, further away, on the other side of the Aegean Sea, and up into this area of the Black Sea, as well as all of this area, right, of the Mediterranean. And they could start their own towns and cities and then grow things at those towns and cities, these colonies, right? And that the colonies would send ships back filled with food back to the main Greek city that they came from. And so that's what the idea was, as well as also being self-sufficient on their own. Now, yes, trade would also happening between the colonies and each other, as well as mainland Greece back to the colonies, okay, for different products, such as clay pottery, some other goods and things like that. Maybe weapons may be made, or bronze and stuff like that, and other minerals, not just food. And so this was the reason why these colonies were started. And beforehand, each colony, the city people, the leaders of the city, of each polis, would go to an oracle. Now, these oracles were a seer or a priestess or a priest, okay, that was able to see the future, okay, according to the Greek religion. And these oracles were these places where these priestesses or seers would be, okay? And sometimes these oracles would have like a cave that was holy, or maybe even a temple built to them, and stuff like that. And there were famous ones, including the oracle at Delphi. That was the most famous one. Well, these seers or priests or priestesses, for a sum of gold, would give a cryptic fortune, okay? So basically like a fortune teller. And so the city would go to these oracles and ask, is it okay? Is the next expedition blessed or not if we send one to go set up a colony in this such and such place? And the answer was usually a cryptic interpretation of it, okay, from what the seer or priest would think would be the future. And almost always, the answer typically from an oracle was yes to colonization. Now, for other answers, for other kind of future telling, fortune tellings and things like that, it was sometimes more cryptic, and obviously they would tell you sometimes different ideas and different facts. We've already talked about one of these, actually, once when we spoke about Croesus of Lydia, when he decided to declare war on Persia, okay? And when he did so, he asked the oracle at the time, what will happen if I declare war on Persia? And the answer was, a great empire will fall. So he took it upon himself to think, oh, I'll win the war. Well, the oracle was telling the truth in this case, but it was his own kingdom fell. Lydia would fall, okay? Croesus of Lydia, if you recall. So that's kind of interesting. But oracles were kind of these fortune tellers, and always when asked about colonization, it was, yes, it is favorable for you to go and colonize this new place, because the oracles realized it was in their best interest to always push colonization, because Greece was constantly having so many people, they were running out of food. Okay, and so the only way to get more food was by setting up these colonies. And as you can see, these green areas are where the Greeks colonized. The blue areas are Phoenician ones, okay, and we've used that map before. And so the two city-states with the most successful colonies were the city-states of Athens and Corinth, although Sparta would actually colonize on the island of Sicily, as well as other places, and that was also successful. But the most two successful ones that had the best colonies, and the most successful colonies otherwise, were Athens and Corinth, okay? So those are the two big ones, and then kind of Sparta in third place. As you can see, all the red areas are where they colonized, okay, which is very similar to the previous map. It just leaves off the Phoenician ones, which aren't Greek, right? The most independent, mostly these colonies were independent and kind of left on their own, and they could make their own decisions and everything else like that, but they kept on sending supplies back and forth to the polis that originated them. Also, during wars, which this will matter later on in this class, in the future lectures, that during wars, the colonies were very loyal to the founding polis, okay? So if the city of Athens founded a colony here, this one would be loyal to Athens. Okay, so if Athens got into a war, say with Corinth, and the colony of Corinth was right here, the two of them would possibly fight it out as well, because their allies were fighting it out on the mainland of Greece. So they were always loyal to the founding polis, or polis. Pottery designs from the former Phoenicians also became extremely important during this Phoenician period, or this Archaic Greece period. They started figuring out the better designs than they had beforehand, and sometimes these were big giant vases, or large amphoras as they were called, to carry olive oil or wine or other products in them. Sometimes they were much smaller, okay, but the designs were from the former Phoenicians. And then this idea of pan-Hellenic culture, okay, pan-Hellenic culture, which means overall Greece, okay, overall this kind of Greek culture is Hellenic culture, became permanent in these areas that were colonized by the Greek colonies, okay? Around the Black Sea area, the Aegean Sea on all sides of it, the Mediterranean Sea in various places, all have lasting pan-Hellenic culture, as well as elsewhere when we get to Alexander the Great. Here's another area of Greek colonies. These gray ones, of course, are the Phoenician colonies, but any of the pink ones are ones from Athens. Any of the Spartan ones are green, okay, so green areas. This is originally where Sparta is. Here is Athens. So the green ones were set up by Sparta, and then the yellow ones were any of the other city-states, including Corinth, okay? And while some of these don't really show how good Corinth did, like out here, Corinth actually became very powerful with some of their ones on Italy as well as elsewhere. Okay? Moving on, let's quickly talk about Greek government and culture. So, there was no main central Greek government, okay? Each polis or city-state was independent. Again, we've already listed some of them. Athens and Sparta, Corinth, Argos, Thebes. Olympia was another one, which was right below the large mountain of Olympias, which was said to have the gods living above it, okay, or on top of it. Eretria, which was an island one. Delos, which was another island in the Mediterranean Sea. Naxos as another one, okay, plus hundreds of others. I could list them for ages, and I still wouldn't get through all of them in a 10-minute video or so, or maybe a 5-minute video. We also have these aristocrats and aristocracy start beginning in Greece at this time, okay, during the Archaic period, and they would go into the Golden Age as well of classical Greece. And what are aristocrats and the aristocracy? Well, they were families that could trace their origins to the Mycenaeans. And because they could trace their origins to the Mycenaeans, or even made it up, they kind of claimed that they were better than everybody else. Kind of like a noble as opposed to a peasant, almost, okay? And so over time, these aristocrats started becoming very wealthy, and started becoming much more powerful than others, okay? And they kind of ruled, and they decided that they ruled because they didn't have to work, because again, many of them had larger plots of land so they could have farms and have workers farm things for them, or they had well-established businesses or wealth from another way, okay? And so this wealth and power helped them be able to grab political office easily, okay? And of course the men were the ones doing this, okay? There were aristocrats that were women, but they didn't have the power. The men did. Well, these aristocrats, sometimes to show off the art and things that they were able to do, as well as get a little bit of political clout, would hold these symposia, or a symposium, okay? And what they would do was an aristocrat would end up basically throwing a party, okay? And these parties would be to show off some art. Okay, whether it was a sculpture like this, or not a sculpture, but a vase painted like this, or maybe it was this giant sculpture of, say, Homer or something like that, or maybe it was some kind of painting on like a wall, or maybe it was poetry or music, or some other kind of major political discussion, or something like that, which was going on, which was culturally popular at the time. What they did with this, though, each time, they would invite all of their aristocratic friends, as well as some others that were not quite aristocrats, that were very also high up in society, okay? But mostly it was just aristocrats. And they would have these parties, and while at these parties, they would have a lot of wine, and they would talk politics. And really, that's what it was about. Yes, it was to show off their wealth by what they funded from this art or poetry, because they would pay for someone to make this art or poetry or something else like that, okay? And it was an excuse to throw the party, as an excuse to get political power, okay? And they would kind of like start pushing their ideas and trying to make contacts. This kind of idea of, you know who you know, and if you know someone more important or powerful, you might be able to get somewhere further in life, right? Was this idea. And so that's what they did. They also no women were allowed at these symposia unless the women were dancers or kind of prostitutes in a way, at these parties, okay? These were men-only parties, okay? Men only, except for, again, unless the women were there for the entertainment, I guess is the best way to say it. Tyranny is another Greek word that we still use today, okay? Tyranny is kind of regarded as a bad word today, okay? Because a tyrant is considered as a bad person, okay? But that wasn't always the case. Usually when someone like one of these aristocrats was trying to gain power, sometimes they would get the rest of the people on their side. And to do so, they had to kind of bribe the people or kind of get them to start believing in the idea that aristocrat believed in and kind of get them into it. And eventually, sometimes these people, these aristocrats that had gotten the will or the majority of the people on their side, would forcefully take power either through like military means, through like an overthrow, or like a unplanned, election, or even the next just election, and would become the new leader of the government. Kind of this new idea of like taking over the government, sometimes forcefully and sometimes not. This was called tyranny because usually that one aristocrat ruled afterwards. And sometimes, yes, he was popular and still listened to the people that got him there in the first place, but sometimes they went off their own idea. And so over time, what used to be an okay word and was a popular idea quickly became, oh, that man is ruling and he's overreaching over all of us. But that was more of the 18th and 19th century, only about 100 to 200 years ago from now, as opposed to 2,000 years ago or more, when tyrant wasn't always a bad word, okay, during the Greeks. Poetry. Let's talk about poetry very briefly. Sappho was a famous poet at the time, and Sappho was a woman, okay? In fact, this is a example of Greek pottery with Sappho on it, okay? That is Sappho right there, and someone is playing a harp, okay, for music. Well, Sappho became very famous during this period because she became known as the 10th muse. Now, what are the muses? Well, the muses are these kind of inspirational gods or goddesses, in this case, most goddesses, okay? There were 9 of them. 9 goddesses that were known as the Muses, and they would inspire everything artistic, and any new ideas and all came from the Muses, these gods, or goddesses rather. Well, Sappho, she was a human, but she was such a good poet, people kind of read her things and started being inspired to write their own. She also taught people on a small island known as the island of Lesbos, and she had her school on that island, which was in the middle of the Aegean Sea. Well, eventually, she became so popular, she became known commonly at that time as the 10th Muse. Okay? So, moving on, we will talk about Hoplite Warfare, as well as the Spartans and Athenians in the 4th and final video of this lecture.